Welcome to the Littoral Zone podcast. I'm your host, Phil Rowley. The Littoral Zone, or shoal area of the lake, is a place where the majority of the action takes place. My podcast is intended to do the same, put you where the action is to help you improve your stillwater fly fishing. On each broadcast, I, along with guests from all over the world, will be providing you with information, tips and tricks, flies, presentation techniques, along with different lakes or regions to explore. I hope you enjoy today's podcast. Please feel free to email me with your stillwater-related fly fishing questions and comments. I do my best to answer as many as we can prior to each episode, just before the main content. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy today's show. The better you understand how trout behave and function, along with the world they live in and the food they feed upon, the better you'll become as a fly fisher. I first met today's guest, Jason Randall, when we were both featured speakers at one of the fly fishing shows several years ago. Jason's science-based approach to fly fishing fascinated me, and I have put his teachings to practical use with excellent results. Jason has authored 4 books, 3 of which form his Trout trilogy. These books focus primarily on how trout function within their environment. While Jason's passion lies in rivers and streams, the research and knowledge he's amassed is equally beneficial to us as stillwater fly fishers. His understanding of how trout see is crucial information for all fly fishers, guiding both our pattern selection and presentation techniques. Information that helps us consistently make the correct pattern and presentation choice. Today, I have the pleasure of delving into the science of how trout see with Jason. I'm confident you will find this episode both enjoyable and beneficial to your stillwater fly fishing. So hi, Jason. How are you? Thanks for joining me on my podcast.
Hi, Phil. Thanks. It's been a while since I've seen you, probably since the last show.
Yeah, I always enjoy our conversations because you're a science guy, in my view, and I have a lot of intriguing questions. But some of my listeners may have not heard you. I don't know why they wouldn't. But anyway, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? I understand you're a veterinarian by profession.
I am. I graduated from veterinary school too many years ago to mention. We don't talk about that anymore, right? And then, after graduation, I did postgraduate work in fish health and medicine, and kind of looked at maybe going into the fisheries career as a veterinarian. And then the more experience I got, the more I realized that really wasn't what I wanted. And so ended up in private practice, but had a very, very strong and longest interest in fish, specifically in trout, and did quite a bit of work in that area and just fascinated by trout and the world they live in.
Yeah, it is a fascinating world, isn't it? Now, you live in the Midwest, correct?
I do. I live in north central Illinois. My home waters are the driftless streams of Wisconsin. I just got back from there yesterday, and we're getting set up for our fall fishing now. And it's just it's a spectacular area. Have you ever been down to the driftless area, Phil?
No, you keep inviting me every time at the shows, and one time I'd like to go because, as you probably know, I have next to my stillwater addiction, I love Euro nymphing. So,
oh man, this is so set up for Euro nymphing too. It's a great healthy fishery. It's fun. It's a lot of spring creeks. It's a very unique area too, and I like that aspect of our sport as well. Stream ecology and even getting into the geology of the areas and such. This is a fascinating area.
Yeah, well, it has such an impact on the waters that flow over the land, isn't it?
Oh, it does. Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah. So how long have you been fly fishing for our viewers that aren't, our listeners rather, that aren't aware?
Yeah. Well, I first picked up a fly rod probably, 40 years ago. And I got frustrated because I really didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have anyone that really spent time with me teaching or mentoring me. And so I became frustrated and kind of put it down for a while. Picked it up a few years later, did have some great mentors at that point, and that made all the difference in the world. And I honestly, my my addiction to fly fishing came in Colorado. We were fishing a small mountain stream there. Our guide spent some time talking about the stream and the habitat and trout. And being an ex-bass fisherman, I was kind of itchy to get fishing, and he kept talking. And then he said, well, let's learn how to cast. And okay, that took another half hour. And, that was just to be able to flip the fly out there. That didn't really give me a lot of experience in casting, but I got enough to get the job done. But I kept thinking, man, we should be fishing. And then he says, relax. About 10:15, there's going to be a massive caddis hatch. And the trout are going to go crazy. And that's when we're going to fish. And I'm like, right. Who can know that? Who could know that? But honestly, probably about 10:15, the river just came alive. Caddis everywhere, rising trout. And that hooked me.
Yeah, it sounds similar to me. Although most people know me for lake stuff, mine was fly fishing rivers and saw fish rising. I think they were eating ants. And I had similar casting lessons to you about enough, what I call enough to be dangerous. About every 12th cast may have landed on the water, but I actually took a fish on a dry fly against a log jam. And the fight that because like you, I had fished conventionally before that. A lot of weight and a lot of, just hunches and guesses out there, not really in tune with the environment. So to catch a fish on a fly rod like that was, like you, I was hooked for life. It was pretty cool.
Oh, it's amazing. And I don't know if it's any consolation to anyone. I'm still taking casting lessons and I'm still haven't perfected it by a long shot.
No, and you know what? That's so true. It's funny. When I was young, you learned to cast so you could fish. And as I've gotten older, I spend more and more time working on my casting, observing others. And when you and I are at shows traveling between speaking commitments and somebody on at the casting pond and I have 5 or 10 minutes, I'll stop and I'll listen. And I always pick something up, right? Some little mechanic, some little change. And I think most of us don't practice our casting enough. We practice our casting at the Vice.
That's true. But I do remember casting competition on one snow day out on the East Coast, and the show was kind of shut down. I remember this Canadian stillwater angler kind of walked away with the honors.
I know. I couldn't believe it. I've never done that since. I just, I think you, Ed Engel, and Landon were like, what?
I know. Who is this guy? What? Yeah. What? How are we going to let this happen?
Yeah, because, I always joke in lakes, we're just happy to hit the water. We don't have to cast into little confined spaces and under branches or any of that stuff. We just got to put it out there and get in control of it before a fish comes. So,
well, that's the coolest part of our sport. I think you can commit yourself, a lifetime in this sport and you're never going to master it. You're still going to be getting better. I like to say that if you quit learning and growing in this sport, at that point, you're the best angler you're ever going to be.
Yeah, or you're no longer on this planet. So
that's true.
That's my motto of my thing, is because you never stop learning. Every time you go out, you learn something new. So that's cool. So you mentioned mentors. Who were some of your mentors? You were fortunate to have some pretty good ones.
I did. And some of the mentors I had early on, like I mentioned, the second time that I picked up a fly fishing rod, I had some people that just took an interest in me, and people like George Kustin and Darren Sakis just spent time with me, and they were experienced anglers. They taught me how to fish wet flies and soft tackles, and which I think is a good place for a beginner to begin. And I grew in the sport, and then certainly had some very influential mentors as time went on. Lefty Kreh took me under his wing, and I like to share his legacy when I teach as well. So much of what we've learned from others, and so every time that I pass on something, we're honoring some mentor that went before us.
Yeah, Lefty was, unbelievable. I remember, every time he talked to you, he always started off, he had a joke. Always a joke.
He did.
Always a joke, yeah. So your association with fishing, you've been able to develop some pro staff relationships. I know you work closely with Temple Fork Outfitters. What's that like?
I do. It's fun. I mean, it's just kind of another area. I think our sport is multifaceted. There's so many different parts of our sport, whether it's science and entomology, trout, fishing, tying flies, casting. And I think this is just one more facet to that beautiful gem in our sport. And it's allowed me to work with rod design and prototype testing. And we were able to bring out, actually, this year, we brought out a brand new European Nymphing Rod called the Elevare, and it won Best New Rod in 24 at ICAST in the recent show. So that's pretty cool.
I might have to, borrow one off you then.
Yeah, we could figure out something. I know a guy.
Okay. Now, of course, this love of fly fishing and you're led to writing, right? You started writing in magazines. Is that how it started?
Yes, it did. I started, you've got an idea and you try to pitch it out there and see what kind of interest there is. And then when you're just starting out, it takes a while. But I did get a few articles written and published, and then it led to the first book. And then the first book led to the second, third, and fourth. And then you're kind of off and running.
So I have to ask you, as a fellow author, my first book, I vowed after I wrote it, I'd never write another one again.
Me too.
Because they're a lot of work.
Yeah.
And I think like you, I think I'm on book 5 now. Now, a lot of mine were fly time, but your books, you get busy behind that computer. You've done your trout fishing trilogy, right?
Right. Well, we did. We started that in 2012, and that was kind of a concept that Jay Nichols, the editor at Stackpole Books, he and I kind of developed together. We wanted a series of books for, maybe studying the more scientific aspects of our sport and looking at we kind of looked at a different topic for each book. The first one was Moving Water, which studied trout in their current driven habitat in streams and rivers. And then we went on to Feeding Time, which was a fly fisher's guide to what, where, and when trout eat, looking at feeding behavior and what they eat, how they eat, when they eat, and kind of what we can do to try to exploit that and catch more of them. Then the third book in that Fly Fisher's Guide trilogy was Trout Sense, which focused on what trout see, hear, and smell. And that was fun. It's kind of they're very scientifically oriented and kind of a reference set, more of a textbook kind of a read. It's definitely not like reading John Gierach. You're not going to get through a chapter a night. It's very informationally dense, but it's good information. And it's been a great resource. I've had a lot of other writers tell me how it's helped them in their research and some of the work that they've been doing. Then the fourth book is Nymph Masters and Fly Fishing Guides from Expert Anglers. And that was a corroborative effort that included 10 great nymph anglers in our sport. And that was a blast to work on that book because, you get to fish with people like Gary Borger and Lefty Kreh and Ed Engel and George Daniel, Landon Mayer, and a lot of other really great nymph anglers. And you get to share, ideas and some of the tips and recommendations that they have.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. Maybe I should do something for lakes on that.
Yeah, you should.
Yeah. Well, and any other new projects to be aware of?
I've kind of taken an extended sabbatical from writing because you know how it is with writing. Mm-hmm. You probably put several thousand hours into a book and it pays so well.
Wow, I need to get your publisher. Oh, I have the same publisher.
That's true. Yes, we do. And so, you can only afford to do a book every once in a while or you'll go broke.
Well, and it's, they do take a lot of work. And
they do.
I was particularly fascinated by, your Trout Sense and Feeding Time because so much of that is applicable to lakes. And I even referenced you a couple of times in my Orvis Guide to Stillwater Fly Fishing, particularly on lunar phase and things like that, which I think we're going to have you back to talk about that because tonight we're going to talk about, specifically what trout see because that's so important. And I think sometimes you have a lot to offer stillwater anglers as well because trout live in the same environment as they do in rivers and streams, just a little less current. We have wind-inducing current, but I think the information in your book is extremely valuable to stillwater fly fishers, with their presentation and understanding how their flies are seen and the impacts of that environment. So that's what I'm looking forward with you today. So why don't we kick that off? Let's get into the meat of it all and get into the science.
Well, the cool thing is, as you just said, trout are visual predators, and they decide what to eat based on their sense of sight. And if it looks good and it passes the test, and we're going to talk a little bit about that test later on in this podcast, but they do kind of have four criteria that they evaluate our fly with. And if we pass that test, they're likely to eat that fly. And that's kind of cool. And so we could take that information right to the stream or lake or stillwater, but we could take it to the fly tying vise too. And it can help us there design and tie better flies, more effective flies as well.
Stonefly nets, nestled in the heart of the Ozarks, Ethan, a master craftsman, dedicates his skill to creating the finest wood landing nets. Stonefly nets are more than just nets. They are part of our story, each cast and every cast. Ready to make your fly fishing trips unforgettable? Visit stoneflynets.com and discover the difference of a handcrafted wood landing net.
So you said trout are visual predators. I've always looked at any kind of animal that has larger eyeballs. It tends to dominate, their decision-making process. They have other senses that they use as well. But you mentioned that they're visual predators, and they make the majority of their decisions based on sight. And of course, there's other senses, lateral line, things like that, air bladder, swim bladder, rather. But you mentioned trout as prey, so let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, they start life as prey. I mean, trout are cool anyway. I mean, in so many reasons they're cool, but they start, right after they come out of the red. They have that yolk sac that sustains them for a while, that nourishes them for a little bit, and then they start eating on small microscopic vegetative organisms, plankton and diatoms and stuff like that. So they start life as a herbivore, if you will, kind of the lowest rung of the food chain. And so they're prey for bigger fish and for other species as well, for herons and birds. And so they start life living in fear of getting eaten. So, but as they grow, they shift and start to climb that food chain. And then they became, at that point, a predator, eating small maybe small invertebrates or insect larvae and small crustaceans. And then as they get larger and grow in size and what they call mouth gape, their mouths get bigger, they can handle bigger food. They actually climb that food rung one more time, and they become a predator that feeds on other predators, whether it's other fish or small mammals like mice or voles, but they make another shift in their predatory focus. And so they kind of climb that food chain, which is very unusual in the animal kingdom, because usually an animal that begins life as a predator, like an eagle or an osprey, they'll stay a predator. Another organism that begins as a prey species like a deer, they always stay as an herbivore. But trout, definitely go through those changes several times through their life. And so they begin life as a prey species. They progress to a predator, but they always retain the visual features of both prey and predator. So they have these these wider set eyes on either side of their face that have kind of a side-looking capacity. So they retain the visual features then of a prey species that's on the alert for threats. And they also evolve because of the shape of the eye. They kind of evolve the visual capacities of a predator that can focus and have very good depth of field to be able to chase and capture prey. So kind of makes them a worthy adversary. Not only are they a predator, but they and have the visual capacity of that, but they also have that visual alert system, always on the lookout for threats, and kind of makes them hard to sneak up on.
Yeah, so true, because a deer has their look at other species, deer, a herbivore, their eyes are predominantly on the side for avoiding threats, whereas a mountain lion or a bear or something that feeds on them, more like our eyes, more, centrally in our head and on our face, as you said, and the ability to focus both eyes on the target so we can catch it.
Yeah, that's true. Think of the difference between a deer and an owl. The owl has has a flat face and forward-looking eyes, and the deer has side-looking eyes. But because of the elliptical shape of the orbit on trout, they can see to the side in perfect clarity, like a prey species that are always on the look for predators, but they can also have fine focus right in front of them. So it'd be like you being able to read a book in front of you, but also have perfect peripheral vision that identifies someone walking through the door to your side. And so it really makes them a worthy adversary as far as trying to catch them.
Yeah. Now, the other thing you mentioned is the impact of light in their world, right? And, that's particularly important for us in lakes because we end up fishing a lot of deep water situations. We could be fishing shallow, less than, at the surface, just under the surface, and 6 to 8 feet of water. We can be fishing, sometimes when we're fishing chironomids, we're fishing down 20, 30, 40 feet or more. And, those trout, they definitely have adapted to those challenging environments. So why don't you talk to me a little bit about light and things that go on there?
Light is the basis of vision, of course. And light in the underwater world is much different than how we perceive it here above water. And there's a lot more attenuation of light with depth, and there's color shifts with water clarity and different aspects of opacity and transmission of light. But the main things that we look at with underwater light is refraction and reflection in that critical angle. And so their view, they really have a very unique view of the world above the water through what we call that window. There's a window right above their heads that allows them to pretty much see, except for 10 degrees on either side, that's that critical angle, allows them to kind of see the full range, almost 180 degrees. It's 10 degrees on either side, so it'd actually be 160 degrees. So it's almost like poking a fisheye lens up through the surface. And so they can see things not only directly overhead, but both sides as well. So it's they kind of live in a world that has a mirrored ceiling and has this round, transparent window to the world above over their heads. It kind of follows them wherever they go. But that is probably one of the most important features as far as surface fishing is what do they see, as food approaches their position. And I will post a pretty neat scenario, a sequence of approaching food as it approaches their visual range. And I'll put that on my social media account that people can reference.
Yeah, we'll provide links to that at the end and in the show notes. Yeah, because refraction is caused by light bending, transferring from one medium to the other, right? It refracts or bends.
That's right.
And it impacts us as well, how we see them, because they are not always where we think appear to be. They're often in a different location, right?
Right.
Typically deeper and closer to you than you think.
That's right. And typically because of the refraction of light, it bends. A lot of times we think we're targeting fish. We think we're putting drifts right over their head, but we could be as many as 2 or 3 feet off. And we could misestimate their depth in the water column as well. So refraction is the bending of light as it passes from a less dense medium, which is air, to a more dense medium, which would be water. So it does really create some misestimations in position when we think we're sight fishing for trout. So typically, we have to make those adjustments in position because they're not really where we see them and think that they are.
Yeah, because I've had, situations where, I'm fishing a clear lake, I can see a target, I cast to it, and I don't let my fly sink long enough because I think it's higher up in the water. So I think I'm getting refusals when the fish is not even seeing it. Right. Or I cast further than the fish is and I accidentally spook it. because I don't drop the leader nicely on top of it down to its level. I crash the fly line on top of it, which is not good. So
No,
yeah,
that's not.
Yeah, I think I had a friend of mine, great analogy he was, a science teacher in school, and he showed me many years ago on a lake. He says, you want to understand how refraction works? Watch this. And he stabbed his fly rod into the water. I looked at it from the side, and you could clearly see the rod appeared to bend and go down, right? Now, for the amount we pay for fly rods, they better not bend when we stick them in water. But it sort of you knew where the rod tip was.
Right.
But the illusion refraction gives you is it looks like it bent and went further down and was closer to you than it really. Yeah,
but that's right.
It was quite interesting. Quite interesting to see. You mentioned attenuation. I think stillwater anglers were very interested in color as it's presented. As we tend to have to deal with deeper situations where our flies can, due to the availability of the light, will change. I think the analogy I was always taught was Roy G. Biv, understanding how light fades or attenuates from one color, and it was red was it red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. I can still remember it.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Not bad for having studied that 75 years ago.
Yeah. So it was, it's a great way to understand how, red is the first color to fade at depth. And there's lots of variables that influence that, like water clarity, suspended matter. I'm sure that other variables as well that get in there and kind of screw it up.
Well, there's some pretty cool stuff too when we start talking about water staining and color shifts and stuff like that, and the variable attenuation of different wavelengths of color. Wavelengths of color are what give us the perception of color itself. So long wavelengths or short wavelengths would either be kind of the red or the blue side of the scale. And so there's certain wavelengths that are well transmitted in freshwater, and certain wavelengths that are less transmitted in freshwater. And then the marine water is a different world altogether. And because that's kind of more of a blue-green skew, we do see different types of wavelength transmission and absorption in those. So certainly, we did a study as part of that book, Trout Sense, where we took a rainbow color board and we took it into different color stained waters: freshwater, marine water, green water, blue water, and brown water. And it kind of looked at the influence of color. And, the color we perceive then in different waters is the color that's not absorbed. So the other colors being absorbed would fade out. And so if you get to a certain depth, most of the colors start to look either muddy. Oftentimes the reds turn to browns and the blues turn to blacks. The colors that were the truest were actually the fluorescent colors. And some of those really, really nice, bright, popping colors really did transmit well. But the one thing we noticed was the accentuation of contrast. And so contrast was always important, was always significant almost in any color shift. And I think we've come to appreciate that when we incorporate things like hotspots and flies and different things that we know are trigger points, and some of the materials that we're using to tie now and create those flies, I think can be very, very effective.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that too in still waters with, whether it's a hot spot out of thread or a fluorescent material or a bead or something, and they do make a difference. I always wonder why a chartreuse and white clouser was such a good fly.
Well,
Fluorescent,
it is. So it's really
chartreuse.
Good because when you think about it, chartreuse is a fluorescent color. It shows up very well in many different color environments. But it also creates a great deal of contrast. And contrast are what trout are really, they see that all the time in the foods they eat. Whether it's a mayfly that's darker on top and lighter on the bottom, or a fish that has a darker dorsal side and a lighter ventral side, the belly. Contrast and that type of thing is a natural thing, and that's certainly one of the triggers in their prey selection. I think we can enhance that too, with some of the things we're doing at the fly tying bench to maybe key in on that a little bit.
Okay, all right. So let's talk about their eyes.
Yeah.
fascinating because they, as I understand it, their eyes are similar to how ours work.
They're similar in a lot of ways and different in some as well.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have a constrictible pupil, so their pupils are fixed in its diameter. They don't adjust to bright and dark light situations by constricting or dilating the pupils like we do. But they also do have a very unique shape to the eye. And this is kind of what we hit upon a little bit earlier with the features of prey and the features of predator both in their vision. They have an elliptical orbit. So it's not a round global orbit like ours. Theirs is an ellipse, more like almost like a football shape, kind of a disc, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have a short focal length area that would give them lateral vision to the side. And that's why they can see things in perfect clarity directly to the side. But they have the long axis of that ellipse kind of directed right over their nose. And so they can have perfect depth of field and what we call binocular vision for prey discrimination right in front of their nose. And so they can literally be focusing on a prey organism right in front and making their decision about whether to eat or not, at the same time that they can see in perfect focus and clarity to the sides. They don't have that macula like we have, where there's a concentration of receptors in one specific area that we use for fine motor skills like reading. They have a more universal distribution of the receptors on the retina, so they can see you while they're eating that mayfly.
That's kind of incredible, right? Because we can't. At least my wife always says I can only look at one thing and I can't pay attention to something
that
else.
is a Y chromosome thing.
Yes, and I think that's enhanced by a television.
And a few drinks, a couple martinis.
Yeah. Or Moscow mules.
Oh,
right?
that's for sure. Yeah. But they also have the same kind of color, the same kind of photoreceptors that we have in the retina. They have cones and rods, very similar to ours as well. Their cones are for color and for very fine, accurate vision. They use that predominantly during daylight feeding activities. And then at night, the rods become the receptor of use. And then that gives them, there's no color perception from the rods. And so they don't see color at night, but neither do we very well either. But the rods are ultra sensitive for low light feeding during low light conditions at night and things like that. So they kind of have an either or use of the cones and rods. So really, they don't have much color discrimination at night. During the day, their cones are engaged and they have kind of the full spectrum of vision that we have. And one of the most frequently asked questions I get is ultraviolet light and how significant is that? And when I did the research on the book Trout Sense, and with my association and the scientific aspect of our sport, I was able to talk and discuss these things with some of the leading experts on trout vision in the world, and the people that are putting out the articles and doing the research. And pretty much the consensus of opinion is that once trout reach the smolt stage or the par stage for non-migratory species, any UV light sensitivity that they might have had early in life has faded out, and they really don't have much more ultraviolet light discrimination than we have. And they do have a little bit in the early stages of their life, which is probably it's probably a survival advantage because they're feeding on, zooplankton and phytoplankton and things like that. And there's a little bit of birefringence in those organisms. And I think maybe that ultraviolet sensitivity at that early stage is probably an advantage. But that is pretty much lost as they go through the developmental stages and beyond the par or small stages. It's pretty much gone, it makes sense anyway, because ultraviolet light, at that end of the visual spectrum, those wavelengths are not well transmitted in freshwater anyway. Freshwater is usually green and brown, not on the blue scale as heavily. And so ultraviolet light is not very well transmitted beyond 6 inches or a foot anyway in freshwater. So ultraviolet is not a big deal for trout as they're feeding anyway. And then the next question is always, should I throw all my ultraviolet materials away? And honestly, I love the stuff, but I don't love it because I think it has any ultraviolet light capacity, nor can I really believe that trout have any ultraviolet light discrimination. But it has a natural iridescence. It's a kind of a color shifter. If you look at it at one angle, it looks blue, black, green, purple. It's kind of like peacock herl. You know how you look at that?
Exactly what I was thinking about. That's peacock herl.
Yeah, or the head of a mallard drake or something. Yeah. That your viewing angle changes the color, and that's a real enhancement to trout. And it's something they naturally see in their prey anyway. Look at the wings of a mayfly or a stonefly. They can almost have a pearlescence quality to them, or like a mother of pearl, like an oyster. So that natural iridescence is a game changer. And I think those materials work, but it's not really because of any ultraviolet light properties per se.
Trout Routes is the most comprehensive mapping app for trout anglers. With over 50,000 trout streams, 350,000 access points, public land maps, and more, Trout Routes is the #1 resource for navigating, researching, and exploring trout streams, and it deserves a place in every angler's toolkit. I was in New York fishing recently. My first time in New York fishing, I had the Trout Routes app, and I was able to check out and access public access points through the maze of private property on the rivers we were fishing. And after I got into the stream and was fishing down through a run, I wasn't quite sure. I saw a house down below. I wasn't quite sure where the property lines ended, but given that I had Trout Routes, I was confident where I was fishing, and I was able to assure that I wasn't trespassing. You will be fully prepared with offline maps. You can get driving directions to points of interest, drop pins, add your notes in the app, all while keeping all of your data private to your account only. You can visit troutroutes.com right now to learn more and download the Trout Routes app for free in the App Store today. That's Trout Routes, TROUTROUTES. Start exploring today.
And I know in lakes where color really comes into us is when we're trying to imitate chironomid pupa or midges. And, where you could be fishing a particular color one day and it's fine, and then all of a sudden something changes in the light and you flip to another color, or obviously another species becomes more active and starts emerging, and that color change is instant to your success. It's like, holy smokes, that's the right fly.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah. And I want to come up there and I want to learn stillwater fishing. And I actually learned a lot by sitting in one of your lectures at the shows for a while and just learning, how depth is critical and how to get your flies to the proper depth. And I think that's fascinating. And I think color, don't you think, I'm not going to ask you this question. Yeah, don't you think that the color at 3 feet, the fly that you choose might be different than the fly that you choose at 20 feet?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because the clearer the water is, the less flashy my flies tend to be,
right?
Because I find those fish in really clear conditions are very wary of particularly larger fish. If anything that just gleams at them like a sign, they like subtlety. Seems to be a better option. Whereas we're fishing more stained water with suspended matter like algae and other particulate. Then we can put a little flash or just to stand out in the crowd. And then when we're fishing deeper, I tend to use a little bit more fluorescence come in to make my flies stand out, or maybe a little more flash to catch any available light because it is so dark down there. I've hung GoPros down there and let them run for half an hour and pull them up. And it's surprising how much light is down there when we're looking down below to 20, 25 feet, it just looks black. But it's a different point of reference when they're looking up at that light source versus us looking down with the light source behind us. So Yeah, it's fascinating, and it's stuff when the action's quiet that just runs through your brain and kind of messes you up every once in a while, gets you overthinking things. But I know for stillwater anglers, the UV question is one I get asked a lot, and I'm happy to say that my belief on it was the same as what you found out. I know early on when UV became all of the rage, there's this belief that trout could see on a different level than we could, but that's not the case, right?
Yeah.
As far as them being an appreciable size for us to matter when we go to catch them, we're not catching fry.
Yeah, you're right. And again, that's some of the early research 20 years ago, I think, created some confusion in our sport when we were really thinking, okay, this is a big deal. All the current research now really points to the very limited role that ultraviolet light might play in the whole thing. And actually, in my research and in my work, and I was a member of the Society for Freshwater Science, the North American Benthic Society. From the scientific standpoint, I got a chance to actually have conversations and talk to these researchers. And one of the leading, researchers in trout vision actually proofed the whole book, Trout Sense, just to make sure I didn't screw it up.
I had that with a couple sections of my book. Rick Hafley did entomology, and I had good friend Brian Chan review the How Lakes Work chapter, which talks about lake turnover and pH and all of that stuff. Because, as you know, if your science is wrong, the rest of the book is garbage.
That's right. But I think the colors at different depths has got to be a real factor for you. And I think it's got to be, one, the attenuation of light with depth. We know that happens, but there's also the selective absorption of preferential absorption, probably I should say, of certain wavelengths, which would be certain colors would fade out with increasing depth, I think. But the true, and again, you can correct me if this isn't your experience as well, but I think the true thing would be contrast is always going to be important. And I think with more attenuation, I think fluorescence become a lot more, more predictable.
Yeah, fluorescence has had a huge impact on our stuff, whether it's through hotspots or whether we're tying flies that are fluorescent orange and don't look like anything natural at all.
That's right.
I think that, and those flies, what we call the attractors, the boobies, the fabs, all these crazy stuff we use.
The mop flies.
Yeah, all that stuff. Sometimes I joke, sometimes the fish sees that and just says, that can't live. It's got to get out of my neighborhood. But also it's the way we fish them. We fish them aggressively, and the trout being using that predatory side of their upbringing, see something running away, they just instinctively want to chase it down and
yeah, that's true. It. Yeah, they are chasers. They're chase driven.
Yeah, you see that when you reel in quickly or swing something, all of a sudden fish that weren't there a second ago are everywhere. So it gives you clues that way. No, it's with us with depth, and it's also not just, I always try to think of depth, not just as vertical, but also distance from the fly. The further the fish is away.
Yeah. I
know we use some of our attractor flies and colors as little magnets, if you will, that the fish will see that from a greater distance than the small, more realistic fly. Come in, see that other fly in the team, if it's legal to fish multiple flies, and then maybe not take that fly and then turn and see the other fly and go, ooh, that looks good. And if it wasn't for that draw of that, the contrast of that fly or that fluorescent color to bring them in, your odds of catching a fish are less because you're now a small, very natural looking thing in a natural environment. You just don't stand out as well.
I think that's a beautiful point. I never fish an attractor by itself.
Yeah.
I always put another second natural fly, because sometimes it just gets their attention. They might follow it a little bit. They get a little closer and they're like, oh, that's edible. I'm going to eat that.
Yeah, no, most jurisdictions in North America can use multiple flies, but there are a few that you can't, which makes that process a little more difficult.
Makes it illegal anyway.
Yeah, definitely. So let's move on. One of the things that fascinated me about your book, and I integrated it and referenced it in my book, was the search image optimization, I think you called it.
That's cool. I love this.
Yeah. Yeah, the analogy I use for this, before we get into it, is you're in a busy mall at Christmas, and you get separated from your wife or your partner, and they're wearing a red jacket. And in order for you to find them, all you're tuned in is looking for that red jacket. You don't have the time or the ability to evaluate everything your eyes see, right? Is that a fair sort of assessment, how trout will work?
I think so. The concept of a search image for a predator is the template that they use to evaluate potential prey meals, whether it's our fly or a natural. And honestly, this concept's been around. I mean, you've probably studied this in college. This was a kind of a ethology or ecology thing, but it was originally described by a researcher. I think he was European, maybe Dutch, and his name was Tim Bergen. And he studied songbirds and how could they pick out successfully prey upon a speckled moth when it literally disappeared when it rested on the bark of a tree. And so over the course of time, he identified criteria that were important in making that decision. That search image, the concept of a search image, has been now expanded to most predators, including trout. And what are there's 4 criteria that they use to decide whether to eat something or whether to refuse something. And it's just a very, very applicable concept, whether it's at the fly tying bench or whether it's on the water, because if we can match that, then we're going to have more success. And the more that the trout sees a particular type of a prey, the more exact and more highly developed and entrenched that search image becomes. And so that explains why trout can sometimes be very selective. And then there's other times when they're feeding more indiscriminately. There's not one specific prey that's predominant and to tighten their focus. And so they feed more opportunistic or less discriminately. But that search image is always in play. And so that the 4 criteria basically it's as long as you match the right food type, the 4 criteria then would be size, shape or profile, which includes proportion, and animation is also another key component, and then color. Those are the 4 things. And so if you're passing your fly over the same trout over and over and over, and he hasn't moved to that fly, you have to literally interpret that as a refusal. So the first 2 things, and actually the first 3 things on that search image, which would be size, proportion, shape and profile is number 2, and 3 is animation. Those things are very evident from long range. Okay, so it's just like us. I mean, you can tell the shape of a Volkswagen Beetle. You can tell that from a school bus from 2 miles down the road. That's obvious from a long range. Okay, and so is proportion. You can tell a Corvette from a minivan from a long ways away, even though they might be similar in size, they're different in shape and proportion. And animation, you can tell those things usually at a distance. And so if you've passed your fly over that fish several times and he's never moved from 4 feet of water, don't bother changing color. Okay, you never got to the point where color was a factor. But if you have a trout that comes up from 6 inches away and looks at your fly, floats underneath it, and then turns away, that's a color-based refusal. Change color, because you're already sold him on the first 3 items. And when he got close enough to really get dialed in and close enough to really see color accurately, he refused. So that's a color-based refusal. So we can learn a lot on either close or far refusals. We can take that and put on the appropriate fly, maybe make the right change.
Yeah, because unfortunately the disadvantage in lakes is we don't get to see that a lot. Most of the times we're fishing blind, we're at depth or distance, but that explains, where you're fishing, you've got the most common insect I've run across in lakes are chironomids, and trout really like to eat them. So the size and the shape of that, and how to present it, how its behavior is, how to incorporate materials in your flies that augment that behavior. It's okay, and then all of a sudden you make the change, and bam, it's on, and it's almost a fish a cast, right?
Yeah.
I think sometimes people tend to look at fish like they're Stephen Hawking or somebody like that, and they're making that kind of cognitive, decision-making process we might make. They don't even know, so it's just instinctive to them, right?
It is.
And we put that in as a, they refused my fly because they're smart. It's like, no, like you said, they were just looking for those criteria and using it as a process of elimination, if you will. And if all looks good and the color's good, that's the final trigger to eat. I think that's a real nugget in this what we're talking about. Because
it's cool because this is not an inclusive list. It's not that other things, don't necessarily detract. If those 4 things are there, they'll take the fly. They're looking for a reason to take the fly. They're not looking for a reason to refuse it because they're in the business of eating. They're looking at reasons why to eat. So it's an inclusive list. If those 4 things are there, they'll eat. If other things are there, it doesn't necessarily mean they won't, because if there's something there that maybe is not natural, the presence of the hook itself is not natural. They'd never eat our fly. Yeah.
Well, that's funny because we see, again, I keep referring to chironomids, but there's lots of discussion in that genre of flies about hook style, whether you should use a scud type hook or a 2 extra curved nymph hook, which is very popular, or a traditional standard shank hook.
That's right.
And all these, how the trout can see, or I've even seen arguments about you've got a rib running up the fly that's kind of bright, shiny, and maybe suggest the trapped gases that the nymph or pupa uses to elevate, but you need to put a shadowing wrap right beside it to suggest the shadow of the segmentation. And I'm thinking, why can't they see the hook? Like, why? I think that's overthinking, because if a trout can see that detail, he's never going to eat your fly, because it is not food, right?
That's right.
That's why they're not eating rocks and pine cones, and well, they do sometimes, I guess, but make mistakes. But I think sometimes we overthink, and we need to. I guess that explains why some of the most suggestive flies that really look like nothing and everything work so well, right? When they're not exact caricature. Here's your nymph, a pheasant tail.
Yeah.
What does that imitate? A woolly bugger.
Right.
Yeah. It's just, like you said, they're dialed to eat. I always joke, they're on weight gainers, not weight watchers. Oh, yeah. Humans tend to weight watch.
We've got to remember, too, that, when the food is served, they've got to eat. They've got to survive the winter. If they're going to do any growth at all, it's in 6 months of the year. And so they're looking to eat and not looking for a reason not to eat. And so, they've got to fatten up during the summer to get through the winter, especially up there in Edmonton.
Yeah, they're probably looking at the menu. We would look at a menu going, well, that's 500 calories and that's that.
That's right.
So, and trout are going, I'll have the whole menu, please. Just feed it down my throat.
Well, they still have the same seasons you have up there. There's only 2 seasons, I think. I heard that the 2 seasons up by you is winter and July.
Well, or winter and construction, but yeah, no, we do have some seasons, but winter is cold. I'm not going to lie. You get a little bit of cold down there, so you're not.
We get we get the Canadian jet stream down here in the Midwest, and it gets kind of chilly.
That's our gift.
Thanks.
Yeah. So you made a note here about how you're interpreting refusals, both at close range and far range. That sounds fascinating to me.
Well, I always look at it from the standpoint that if I've cast my fly to a trout and he never moved to it, that if I know I've got an edible imitating fly, it's a fly that they'll eat, then, the first things I'm going to think are the first 2 items on that search image. The size is off, or maybe the shape and profile are off. If I know it's an edible, imitating an edible food, something's off. But if that trout comes up close and looks at my fly, and I've got a tan caddis on, well, maybe I should have a green caddis on for that one. A close range refusal, in my experience, is usually color based. Long range refusal is usually I screwed up and I spooked the fish, or the fly is wrong, or something like that.
No, that's fascinating. That's stuff we can use. So this has been very fascinating. I could go on. This stuff I love getting into the weeds and going down paths that probably at the end of the day don't make anything relevant to fishing, but it's just
it's
fun
esoteric,
to know.
but it gives us something to talk about.
Well, exactly. Something to blame our lack of success on. Well,
we don't want to blame our poor casting.
we can never look at ourselves, right? It's never our fault. But yeah, so I think in the future, because your other book talks about 2 things that are very important to stillwater fishers, where I get asked a lot on, and that's the impact of weather change, barometric pressure, and the impact of the moon. So I think I'm going to have you back to talk about those specifically, because they are covered in your Trout Sense book. And I did refer to your explanation, without getting into it, about the impacts of full moon.
Oh, it is. It's cool stuff. I mean, anything that
yeah.
can move the tides and move that volume of water has got to have an influence in the natural world as well. So, I mean, that's a whole topic by itself.
Yeah, exactly. And I'd love to have, if you're up to it,
I'll do it.
A few weeks or months, we'll have you back. So, so what's up next for you? Where are you going?
Well, I like doing, during this time of year, I like doing some on-stream schools, and I do different programs for different clubs and organizations. And I've got a couple still yet for this year, both in the Driftless area and into some other areas. I'm going to be doing one in Missouri in November as well, one in the Driftless area in September. And I just do love spending time on the water in an educational type of situation. So I've got that, and then we get into the holidays, and the holidays are, for us, our family and kids and grandkids, and spending time together, and boy, that's just great. And then we just go right into show season, where I'll be hanging out with my favorite Canadian.
You usually find me in the bar waiting for you.
I know.
Or you can introduce. You got me hooked on those Moscow mules.
I know. They're pretty good.
They were pretty good. So how can listeners get a hold of you? What's the best way?
Probably the best way is on social media. And I do put a lot of educational material on Instagram. And so they can reach me it would be at Jason Randall Fly Fishing. And I try to I do put a few pictures of the grandkids and, pictures of my dog and stuff like that, and the occasional fish picture. But I really try to put a lot of content on there. And so some of the illustrations that we've, for the topics we've discussed, will be on there if they dig back through some of the, previous postings. And if there's anything that we discuss, that needs to go up, I'll put it up. But certainly Instagram is a great place. I don't have a website anymore. I stopped kind of visiting that and kind of let it die a natural death.
They are a lot of work.
They are. And I was blogging, and it's like, oh, that takes too much time. And so I just I'll talk to you and on your podcast, and that works pretty well. But and then I'll be at most of the fly fishing shows this year, and hanging out there, and love to spend time, in that type of an educational format, and love talking to other anglers. And it's cool because a lot of times they come up and say, hey, have you thought of this? Or, in my experience, I've seen this. And then we all get to learn. And we're all in this sport as life learners.
Yeah, well, that's, I think, so important, because a lot of people might go, well, I don't fish. I don't fish rivers. I don't fish saltwater. I don't fish bass or whatever. And it's like, hold on. They all have, there's way too many similarities and so much to learn from each other. So your two books I would recommend would be your Trout Sense, because a lot of what we talked about is in here today, and we'll come back, as I said, to the lunar phase and weather at another day, another time. And of course, feeding time. I think that information is incredibly valuable. I can't compliment you enough for doing that, because it's in the past, it's been so hard to find that information that's, science-based and not just somebody's hunch or something they've brought up on has no basis, not necessarily in fact, but just very difficult to quantify.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I do kind of warn readers that if they're not familiar with that, it reads very much like a textbook, and that's the way it was designed. It was designed as a reference and a source for anglers that are maybe looking for that type of information. It's very informationally dense. It's much, much more like a textbook than it is John Gierach.
Yeah, but I think that's important stuff. If people want to improve as fly fishers out there and understand, a world that we'll never get to really know, right? Because we are humans and they are trout. So, so where can they pick up your books? Obviously, you don't have them on the website anymore. Just local fly shops online. Yeah,
they're on Amazon too, and the fly fishing shows always have them, and they're usually pretty universally available. I know Trout Sense was out of print for a while. It was had done a couple of runs already, but they've actually got it back going again, I think. And so I think they're all available, and Amazon is probably as good a resource as any.
Yeah, and I encourage any of my listeners, if you're at a fly fishing show, it's called The Fly Fishing Show, theflyfishingshow.com, and check out the various shows and see if Jason's there. And if you're a stillwater fly fisher, go attend one of his presentations, even if it's about rivers and streams. Trust me, there'll be a ton of information in there.
The dark side.
The dark side, the very applicable to our stillwater challenges. And Jason, I just want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day, talking
Thanks,
with
Phil.
me. Like I said, I could have kept you for hours getting into the weeds, but we'll maybe do that over a beverage one night, or
let's do it again.
Authors, but yeah. So thanks so much, and again,
Thank you, sir.
All of the links to Jason's Instagram account, Jason Randall Fly Fishing, will be down in the show notes. So please give Jason a visit, a follow, help him grow his presence, and there's just tons of information in there. So again, thanks so much, Jason, and we'll see you next time on the Littoral Zone podcast.